Welcome, dear listener, to a place where mysteries come alive. Here, we bring you timeless tales of clever detectives, hidden motives, and unexpected twists. Whether it's the daring charm of Tommy and Tuppence, or the keen intellect of Poirot, every story invites you to think, to feel, and to solve the case. Stay curious, and welcome to Guardian of the Night Stories. The Morning Post arrived at the Beresford residence with its usual punctuality, accompanied by the rattle of the letterbox and a cheerful whistle from the postman. Tommy Beresford, comfortably ensconced behind his newspaper at the breakfast table, barely looked up from the crossword puzzle that had been vexing him for the past 20 minutes. "Darling," came Tuppence's voice from across the table. "When you said you wanted a quiet life after all our adventures, I don't think you meant to become quite so sedentary." Tommy lowered his paper with dignified slowness. "I am not sedentary. I am contemplative. There's a difference." "Of course there is," Tuppence replied, her eyes sparkling with mischief as she sorted through the morning's correspondence. "One involves thinking, and the other involves napping behind a newspaper." "I have never—" Tommy began, but was interrupted by a most peculiar sound from his wife. It was half gasp, half laugh, the sort of noise that meant Tuppence had discovered something interesting. "Tommy, you must see this." She held up a cream-coloured envelope. Expensive stationery that caught the morning light. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural in its perfection. Tommy set down his paper entirely now, recognizing the signs. After 15 years of marriage and countless mysteries solved together, he knew that particular tone in Tuppence's voice. It meant their quiet morning was about to become decidedly less quiet. "What is it?" "A letter from someone I haven't thought of in years. Deanna Marchmont. Do you remember her? We met at that dreadful garden party in Surrey 3 summers ago." Tommy frowned, searching his memory. "Tall woman? Rather elegant? Had a brother who was something in the Foreign Office." "That's the one. Though her brother died last year, I'm afraid. She's written to say she's in rather a spot of trouble, and wondered if we might help." Tuppence's eyes were already alight with curiosity, that familiar spark that had led them into more adventures than Tommy cared to count. "What sort of trouble?" Tuppence read aloud. "Dear Mrs. Beresford, I hope you will forgive this intrusion, but I find myself in circumstances so peculiar that I hardly know where to turn. A week ago, my cousin Gerald was found dead in the library of our family home, Ashcroft Manor. Under circumstances the police have ruled a tragic accident. However, I have reason to believe it was murder, and what's more, I fear I know who is responsible. The difficulty is this: the person I suspect has what the detective novels call an unbreakable alibi. He was witnessed by 4 people, including myself, at a dinner party in London at the precise time Gerald died, 50 miles away. Yet my intuition insists I am not wrong. I wonder if you and Mr. Beresford might spare a few days to visit. I know it's an imposition, but I remember you mentioning that you and your husband had some experience in these matters. Yours in desperation, Diana Marchmont." Tommy set down his teacup with a slight clink. "An unbreakable alibi, you say? That's what makes it interesting, doesn't it?" Tuppence's eyes gleamed. "The impossible problem. We don't know anything about the circumstances. It could very well have been an accident. With a desperate woman writing to virtual strangers for help? I think not." Tuppence was already rising from her chair, the letter clutched in her hand. "Besides, when was the last time we had a proper puzzle to solve? You've been complaining about being bored for weeks." "I have not been complaining. You've done the Times crossword in under 10 minutes for the past fortnight. That's the same thing." Tuppence moved to the writing desk by the window. I'm going to wire her that we'll come. We can take the afternoon train to Sussex." Tommy knew when he was beaten. In truth, he felt a small thrill of anticipation himself. There was something about a locked-room mystery, or in this case, an impossible alibi, that appealed to his logical mind. "Very well," he said, folding his newspaper with deliberate care. "But Tuppence, we're merely going to listen to what she has to say. We're not the police. Of course not, darling. We're much better." Tommy couldn't help but smile. "I'll pack our bags." By 3 o'clock that afternoon, they were seated in a first-class carriage bound for Sussex, watching the London suburbs give way to rolling countryside. The spring afternoon was pleasant, with clouds scudding across a pale blue sky. "Tell me what you remember about Diana Marchmont," Tommy said. Having settled himself comfortably with a book, he had no intention of reading. Tuppence gazed out the window, gathering her thoughts. She was reserved, I suppose you'd say. Quite intelligent, but careful with her words. Proper in that old-fashioned way. Her family has money, old money, the sort that comes with estates and expectations. And this cousin Gerald, I never met him, but she mentioned him once. Said he'd been rather wild in his youth, but had settled down after the war. Most of them did, didn't they? The ones who came back. Tommy nodded soberly. The war had changed everyone it touched, himself included. Some wounds ran deeper than others. What about the brother who died? He asked. Anthony. He was in the Foreign Office, as you remembered. Died of a heart attack last winter. Diana inherited the family estate when he passed. Ashcroft Manor, she called it. So this Gerald who died, where does he fit in? Second cousin, I believe, from the other branch of the family. Tuppence turned from the window, her expression thoughtful. I wonder what makes her so certain it was murder. The police must have investigated. Country police, Tommy said mildly. They see what they expect to see. If it looked like an accident, they'd have no reason to probe deeper. But Diana saw something they missed, or thinks she did. That's what we're going to find out, isn't it? The train carried them through the afternoon, past villages with names like Haywards Heath and Burgess Hill, deeper into the Sussex countryside. Tommy watched his wife's profile, noting the familiar set of her jaw that meant her mind was already working on the puzzle. After all these years, all these cases, he knew that look. Tuppence had the bit between her teeth now, and there would be no stopping her until the mystery was solved. The only question was whether they were heading toward a genuine murder investigation or a grieving woman's imagination. Tommy suspected they would know soon enough. The train began to slow as they approached their station. Through the window, Tommy could see a small village station with flower boxes on the platform and a weathered sign that read, Ashcroft Halt. This is us, Tuppence said, already reaching for her handbag. As they stepped onto the platform, a woman detached herself from the shadow of the station house. She was tall and elegantly dressed in dove grey, her face partially obscured by a fashionable hat. Mrs. Beresford. Mr. Beresford? Her voice was cultured, controlled. I'm Diana Marchmont. Thank you so much for coming. But as she stepped into the light, Tommy saw what her careful composure couldn't quite hide. The shadows under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the white-knuckled grip on her handbag. Whatever Diana Marchmont believed about her cousin's death, she wasn't imagining her fear. She was terrified. The drive to Ashcroft Manor took them along narrow lanes bounded by high hedgerows, the kind of quintessentially English countryside that appeared on postcards and railway posters. Diana Marchmont's motor car, a well-maintained Bentley that had seen better decades, handled the winding roads with practiced ease. "I apologize for the melodrama of my letter," Diana said, breaking the silence that had held since they'd left the station. "I'm not usually given to asking strangers for help." "We're hardly strangers," Tuppence said warmly from the back seat, "and there's no need to apologize for reaching out when you need assistance." Diana's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "The truth is, I don't know who else to trust. The police think I'm a hysterical woman. My family thinks I'm making trouble where none exists. But I know what I know." "Why don't you start at the beginning?" Tommy suggested. "Tell us about Gerald." "Gerald Ashcroft was my second cousin, though we grew up rather like siblings. When my parents died, his family took me in for a time. He was 3 years older than I, always getting into scrapes, always charming his way out of them." A sad smile crossed her face. "He enlisted in 1914, same as everyone. Came back in 1919 changed, as they all did. Started drinking too much, spending too freely. But in the past year, he'd seemed to turn a corner. Said he'd found something that would secure his future." "What was that?" Tommy asked. "I don't know. He wouldn't say. But he'd moved back to the manor. He'd been living in London and seemed purposeful. For the first time in years, he had direction." They crested a hill, and Ashcroft Manor came into view. It was a handsome Georgian structure of honey-coloured stone, set in grounds that rolled down to a small lake. The late afternoon sun painted it in shades of gold and amber. "It's beautiful," Tuppence breathed. "It's been in the family for 200 years, Diana said quietly. "My brother Anthony loved it. When he died, I inherited it, along with responsibilities I never wanted. Gerald had lived here on and off for years. I didn't mind. It felt less empty with him here." As they pulled up to the front entrance, Tommy noted the well-kept grounds, the fresh paint on the window frames. Someone was spending money maintaining the place. A butler emerged from the front door, elderly and dignified, moving with the careful precision of advanced arthritis. "Meadows has been with the family for 40 years, Diana explained as they climbed out of the car. "He was devoted to my brother and quite fond of Gerald, despite everything." Meadows helped with their bags, his lined face carefully neutral. "Good evening, Miss Diana. Shall I show the guests to the Blue Room and the Rose Room?" "Yes, thank you, Meadows. We'll have tea in the drawing room in 20 minutes. The interior of Ashcroft Manor was as elegant as its exterior promised. High ceilings, crown moulding, paintings that spoke of taste and old money. But there was something else too, a sense of watchfulness, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Once they were settled in the drawing room, a spacious chamber with French windows. Overlooking the garden, Diana poured tea with hands that trembled only slightly. "Gerald died a week ago last Tuesday," she began without preamble. "I had gone up to London for a dinner party at the home of Marcus Thornley, a friend of my late brother's. The party was planned weeks in advance, 8 guests, very formal. I left here at 3 in the afternoon, arrived in London by 5, and didn't return until the following morning." "And Gerald remained here?" Tommy asked. "Yes, he said he had work to do. He'd been spending hours in the library, going through old family papers. I thought nothing of it." Diana set down her teacup. The next morning, Meadows found him at the base of the library stairs. His neck was broken. The police concluded he'd been reaching for a book on the upper gallery, lost his balance, and fell. "Were there any signs of struggle?" Tommy asked. "None. That's what made the police so certain. No defensive wounds, nothing out of place, just an accident. But you don't believe that," Tuppence said gently. Diana met her eyes. Gerald was afraid of heights, genuinely phobic about it. He never, ever used the upper gallery. He would ask Meadows to fetch books rather than climb those stairs himself. The idea that he would go up there alone at night is absurd. Tommy leaned forward. You mentioned in your letter that you suspect someone with an unbreakable alibi. Who? Diana took a deep breath. Richard Thorne. He was at the dinner party in London with me. He never left the table during dinner, and afterward we all played bridge until past midnight. 4 people can testify he was there the entire time. Yet I believe he killed Gerald. What makes you think so? Because Gerald was afraid of him. In the days before I left for London, Gerald kept asking me questions about Richard. When he was coming to visit next, whether he'd mentioned needing money, whether I trusted him. Diana's voice dropped. The day before I left, I overheard Gerald on the telephone. He was agitated, almost angry. He said, "You can't buy your way out of this, Richard. Not this time." Richard Thorne, Tommy repeated, committing the name to memory. What's his connection to the family? He was engaged to my cousin Beatrice before the war. She died in the influenza epidemic of 1919. Richard took it very hard. He and Gerald had been close friends, but after Beatrice's death, something changed between them. Richard became a frequent visitor here, ostensibly keeping up the friendship, but there was always tension. Is he a wealthy man? Tuppence asked. He inherited a considerable fortune from his father last year. Investments, property in London. But money has a way of disappearing quickly if one isn't careful. Tommy stood and walked to the French windows, gazing out at the peaceful grounds. You said Gerald was found at the base of the library stairs. May we see the library? Of course, Diana rose, relief evident in her face. I hoped you might want to examine the scene. The library was a magnificent room, with walls lined floor to ceiling with books. A wrought iron spiral staircase led to an upper gallery that ran along 3 walls. The books on the upper shelves were older, leather-bound volumes that likely hadn't been disturbed in decades. He was found here, Diana said quietly, indicating a spot at the base of the staircase. Meadows discovered him at 7 the next morning when he came to open the curtains. Tommy examined the staircase carefully. It was sturdy, well-maintained, with a polished wooden banister. At the top, the gallery was perhaps 15 feet above the ground floor, high enough for a fall to be fatal. Where was Gerald working before you left for London? Tuppence asked. At that desk. Diana pointed to a large mahogany desk positioned between 2 windows. He had papers spread out everywhere. Family documents, old letters, ledgers from my grandfather's time. Tommy crossed to the desk. It was neat now, cleared of papers. What happened to the documents he was reviewing? The police took some as evidence, but most were simply gathered up and filed away. I haven't looked at them. I couldn't bear to. We'll need to see them, Tommy said gently. Of course, Meadows can show you where they are. Tuppence had wandered to the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines. What was Gerald researching? He never said precisely, but I had the impression it had something to do with the family history. Perhaps property deeds or old business dealings. My grandfather was quite the entrepreneur in his day. Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence. They'd learned long ago that family secrets often had long roots, reaching back through generations. This Richard Thorne, Tommy said. When will we meet him? Diana glanced at her watch. He's coming to dinner this evening. I invited him at your suggestion. Well, I assumed you'd want to meet him. He accepted immediately. He's been very attentive since Gerald's death. Almost too attentive. Interesting, Tuppence murmured. There are others coming as well, Diana continued. I thought it best to gather everyone who knew Gerald. Dr. Waverley, our local physician, who examined the body. My cousin Margaret and her husband Robert, who live in the village. And Stella Drayson, who was... Well, there were rumours that she and Gerald had an understanding. "A full house party," Tommy observed. "How very Christie of you, Diana." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I read detective stories too, Mr. Beresford. I thought it might help to have everyone in one place." As they left the library, Tommy paused in the doorway, looking back at the room. Something about it nagged at him, something not quite right. But he couldn't put his finger on what. "Tommy?" Tuppence's voice recalled him. "Coming, dear." But as they climbed the stairs to dress for dinner, Tommy's mind was already working on the puzzle. A man who feared heights, found dead at the base of a staircase. A suspect with an unbreakable alibi. Family secrets hidden in old papers. And underneath it all, the question that neither he nor Tuppence had yet voiced. If Richard Thorne had been in London when Gerald died, how could he possibly have killed him? Unless, of course, the unbreakable alibi was exactly that. And Diana was wrong about everything. Dinner at Ashcroft Manor was a peculiarly English affair. Excellent food served with impeccable formality, while beneath the polished surface, currents of tension and suspicion flowed like underground rivers. Tommy, changed into his evening clothes, surveyed the assembled guests with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read people through years of investigation. Tuppence, resplendent in a jade-green dress that brought out her eyes, was already engaged in animated conversation with Dr. Waverley, drawing him out with her characteristic charm. Richard Thorne stood by the fireplace, a whisky in hand, the very picture of a gentleman at leisure. He was handsome in a sharp-featured way, probably 40, with dark hair showing distinguished threads of silver at the temples. His evening clothes were Savile Row, his shoes handmade. Money, Tommy thought, and the confidence that came with it. "Mr. Beresford," Thorne said, extending his hand as Tommy approached. "Diana tells me you and your wife are something of amateur investigators." "How fascinating! We've dabbled," Tommy replied mildly, accepting the handshake. Thorne's grip was firm, almost aggressive, though amateur makes it sound rather more grand than it is. "We've simply found ourselves involved in a few peculiar situations over the years. Diana is convinced Gerald's death wasn't an accident." Thorne's voice was smooth, but his eyes were watchful. "I confess I don't understand her reasoning." "The police were quite thorough, were they?" Tommy asked. "I find country police are often eager to file away anything that doesn't immediately present as foul play. Less paperwork, you understand." Something flickered in Thorne's eyes. Annoyance. Alarm? It was gone too quickly to identify. Gerald was my friend. If I thought for a moment his death was anything other than a tragic accident, I'd be the first to demand justice. "Of course," Tommy said non-committally. Across the room, Tuppence had moved on from Dr. Waverley to engage with Cousin Margaret and her husband Robert. Margaret was a faded blonde in her mid-40s, with the sort of nervous energy that suggested perpetual anxiety. Robert Ashcroft, he'd taken his wife's maiden name, Tommy had learned, was a stolid, red-faced man who looked more comfortable in tweeds than evening dress. "It's all very distressing," Margaret was saying to Tuppence. "Gerald could be difficult, I won't deny it, but he was family. And now Diana is stirring up trouble with these wild theories." "Hardly wild," came a cool voice from the doorway. "When a man who's terrified of heights is found at the base of a tall staircase, questions must be asked." The speaker was a striking woman in her early 30s, dark-haired and dark-eyed, with the kind of beauty that came from good bones and expensive grooming. She wore black, but it was elegant rather than mourning, and a rope of pearls glowed against her throat. "Stella," Diana said, a note of warning in her voice. I'm glad you could come. I wouldn't have missed it." Stella Drayson's gaze swept the room, lingering on Richard Thorne with an expression Tommy couldn't quite read. After all, Gerald's death affects us all, doesn't it? In one way or another. Meadows announced dinner, and they processed into the dining room with careful formality. Tommy found himself seated between Margaret and Dr. Waverley, with Tuppence directly across from him, positioned next to Richard Thorne. His wife caught his eye and gave him a small smile that said she'd manoeuvred the seating deliberately. "You examined Gerald's body, Doctor," Tommy said to Waverley as the soup was served. "What were your findings?" Waverley was a thin, scholarly-looking man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a precise manner. Broken neck from the fall. Death would have been instantaneous. There were no other injuries, no signs of struggle. Time of death somewhere between 8 and 11 the previous evening. No indication of anyone else being present. None whatsoever. The library door was locked from the inside. The key was in Gerald's pocket. When Meadows couldn't rouse anyone that morning, he had to fetch the spare key from the housekeeper's room. "Locked from the inside?" Tommy repeated thoughtfully. "Quite impossible for anyone to have been with him," Margaret interjected, "which is why Diana's suspicions are so absurd. Richard was in London with her the entire evening." "I haven't accused anyone of anything," Diana said quietly from the head of the table. "Haven't you?" Stella's voice was sharp. "You've brought in investigators, gathered us all here like suspects in an Agatha Christie novel. What are we supposed to think?" "I think," Tuppence said calmly, "that Diana has questions about her cousin's death, which is entirely natural, and we're simply here to help her find answers." "What answers?" Robert demanded, his face reddening. "The police investigated. It was an accident. Tragic, yes, but these things happen, do they?" Tommy asked mildly. "How often does a man with a known phobia of heights go climbing spiral staircases at night?" A brief silence fell over the table. "People do irrational things," Thorne said smoothly. "Perhaps he needed a particular book. Perhaps he'd been drinking and lost his inhibitions." "Gerald hadn't been drinking," Diana said firmly. "I asked Meadows. The decanter in the library was untouched." "Then perhaps," Thorne began, but he was interrupted by a crash from the direction of the kitchen, followed by raised voices. Meadows appeared in the doorway, his elderly face flushed. "I do apologize, Miss Diana. Mrs. Cratchit has had a small accident with a serving dish. Nothing serious. Is she all right?" Diana half rose from her chair. "Perfectly well, miss. Just a little shaken." But as Meadows withdrew, Tommy noticed the butler's hands were trembling, and there was something in his expression that suggested the accident had been more than a dropped dish. The meal continued with strained civility, conversation turning to safer topics: the weather, London theatre, the latest political developments. But Tommy noticed Stella watching Richard Thorne with an intensity that suggested unfinished business between them. He noticed Margaret's nervous glances at her husband. He noticed Diana's careful control beginning to fray. Most of all, he noticed Richard Thorne's studied nonchalance, the performance of a man who wanted everyone to believe he had nothing to hide. After dinner, the ladies withdrew, leaving the men to their port and cigars. It was an old-fashioned ritual, one that Tommy had always found rather silly, but it did have the advantage of loosening tongues. "So, Beresford," Thorne said, lighting a cigar with deliberate care, "what's your theory? How did I manage to murder Gerald while sitting at a dinner party 50 miles away?" The directness caught Tommy off guard, which was no doubt the intention. "I haven't formed a theory yet." "But Diana has put the idea in your head, hasn't she? That's why you're here." Thorne blew out a stream of smoke. "I understand. She's upset looking for someone to blame. I was Gerald's closest friend. I suppose I'm a convenient target. Were you close? Tommy asked. I understood there had been tension. Thorne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Gerald could be difficult. We had our disagreements, but we'd known each other since school. That counts for something. What did you disagree about? Money, mostly. Thorne shrugged. He was always asking me for loans. I helped when I could, but a man has limits. The last time I refused him, he became quite angry. Said I owed him more than money could repay. I didn't know what he meant. And you never found out? No, that was the last real conversation we had. 2 weeks before he died, Dr. Waverley cleared his throat. If I may say so, all this speculation is pointless. Gerald's death was an accident. A tragic one, but an accident nonetheless. You seem very certain, Doctor, Tommy observed. I am certain. I've practiced medicine for 35 years. I know what an accidental death looks like. And what does murder look like? Waverley's face reddened. That's an offensive question, is it? Tommy kept his voice mild. I'm merely trying to understand how you can be so sure. Before Waverley could respond, they were interrupted by a cry from the drawing room. A woman's voice, sharp with shock. Tommy was first to the door, the other men close behind. They found the ladies standing in a tight group, Tuppence holding Diana's arm, while Stella stared at something on the floor. It was a piece of paper, folded once, that had apparently been slipped under the drawing room door. What is it? Tommy asked. Diana's face was white. A note. It says, ask them about the photograph. Ask them what Gerald found. What photograph? Margaret demanded. What is this nonsense? But Diana had turned to Meadows, who had appeared in response to the commotion. Meadows, was anyone near this room in the last 10 minutes? No, Miss Diana. I've been in the pantry, and Mrs. Cratchit has been in the kitchen. The house has been quiet. Someone put this note under the door, Diana insisted, holding up the paper. Someone in this house. Tommy took the note from her, examining it. The paper was ordinary, the handwriting printed in block capitals, deliberately disguised. But the message was clear enough. Someone wanted them to know about a photograph, about something Gerald had found, and someone had been watching them, listening to their dinner conversation, waiting for the right moment to deliver this message. Tommy looked up to find Richard Thorne's gaze fixed on him, the urbane mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something harder underneath. Well, Thorne said quietly, it seems Diana's theories have attracted an ally. How very intriguing. But as Tommy met his eyes, he saw something else there. Not just anger or defensiveness, but something that looked remarkably like fear. Someone in Ashcroft Manor was very afraid indeed. And afraid people, Tommy knew from long experience, were dangerous. The note had shattered the evening's pretense of civility. Within 20 minutes, the guests had made their excuses and departed. Margaret and Robert to their cottage in the village, Dr. Waverley to his surgery, Richard Thorne to the guest house on the estate where he'd been staying. Only Stella had lingered, accepting Diana's offer of a guest room rather than driving back to her flat in Brighton. Now, with the house finally quiet, Tommy, Tuppence, and Diana sat in the library where Gerald had died. The mysterious note spread on the desk before them. The photograph, Diana said for the third time. What photograph? You mentioned Gerald had been going through family papers, Tuppence said gently. Could he have found an old photograph? Something significant? But significant how? And what does it have to do with his death? Tommy had been examining the desk drawers. They were mostly empty now. The papers Gerald had been studying apparently filed away. But in the bottom drawer, he found something interesting. A magnifying glass, still lying where it had been left, as though someone had been examining documents closely. Diana, he said, You mentioned the police took some of Gerald's papers as evidence. Did they return them? Yes, Meadows put them back in the estate room. They're probably still there. Show us. The estate room was a small chamber off the library, essentially a large closet converted to hold documents. Filing cabinets lined 2 walls, and a work table in the centre was covered with neat stacks of folders, each labelled in a careful hand. These are what the police returned, Diana said, gesturing to the table. They said there was nothing relevant to the investigation. Tommy began sorting through the papers methodically. Most were exactly what one would expect. Property deeds, tax records, business correspondence dating back to Diana's grandfather's time. But tucked into a folder marked Personal 1919, he found something interesting. It was a letter, dated October 1919, written in a woman's hasty scrawl. "My dearest Anthony," it read, "I know you think I'm being foolish, but I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. Richard's story about that night doesn't match what Beatrice told me before she fell ill. She said Richard had been in London that entire week, yet he claims he was with her when she first showed symptoms. Why would he lie? And why does he seem so anxious when I mention it? Perhaps I'm imagining things. This wretched flu has everyone on edge, but I wanted you to know, just in case. Your loving sister, Margaret." "Margaret," Tuppence breathed. "Your cousin Margaret?" Diana stared at the letter. "Yes, but she never mentioned this, not even when Beatrice died." "Beatrice was engaged to Richard Thorne," Tommy said slowly. "She died of influenza in 1919, but according to this letter there was something questionable about Richard's whereabouts when she fell ill." "What are you suggesting?" Diana asked. "I'm not suggesting anything yet, but it's interesting, isn't it? Gerald was going through these old papers, presumably found this letter, and shortly thereafter, he's dead, with Richard Thorne high on your list of suspects." Tuppence was looking through another folder. "There's more here. Bank statements from 1918 and 1919. Someone's made notes in the margins." She peered closer. The handwriting looks like Gerald's. He's circled several large withdrawals. £500, £300, £200, all made by, she looked up, her eyes wide, by Richard Thorne. Thorne had access to the family accounts? Tommy asked Diana. He was engaged to Beatrice. My grandfather was fond of him. Gave him signing authority on one of the estate accounts. After Beatrice died, I assumed the arrangement had ended. Apparently not, Tommy murmured, studying the statements. These withdrawals continued for months after Beatrice's death. And look at this. A note in Gerald's handwriting. RT withdrew $2,000 total. Never repaid. Where did it go? Diana sank into a chair, her face pale. You think Richard was stealing from the family? I think Gerald thought so, Tommy said. The question is, what did he plan to do about it? Confront him, Tuppence said. That telephone call Diana overheard. You can't buy your way out of this, Richard. Not this time. Gerald must have discovered the theft and demanded repayment. Or threatened to expose him, Tommy added. But Richard was in London when Gerald died, Diana protested. I was with him. We all were. An unbreakable alibi, Tommy said quietly. Yes, which means either you're wrong about Richard being the murderer, or what? Or the alibi isn't as unbreakable as it appears. A soft knock at the door made them all jump. Meadows entered looking apologetic. I'm sorry to disturb you, Miss Diana, but I thought you should know. I've just checked the servants' entrance. It was unlocked. Unlocked? Diana stood quickly. But you always lock it at night. I did lock it, miss, at 9 o'clock as usual. But just now, when I went to check, it was standing open. Someone's been in the house, Tuppence said. Or gone out, Tommy added grimly. They followed Meadows to the servants' entrance, a small door at the rear of the house that opened onto the kitchen garden. Sure enough, it stood ajar, and when Tommy examined it closely, he saw fresh scratches around the lock. "Picked," he said. "Recently, by the look of it." "But who?" Diana began. "Someone who wanted access to the house," Tommy said. "Someone who slipped that note under the drawing-room door and then left before being discovered. Or someone who's been watching us," Tuppence added, glancing out into the dark garden. "Someone who knows we're asking questions." They secured the door and returned to the library. Stella Drayson was descending the main staircase in a dressing gown, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "I heard voices," she said. "Is everything all right?" Diana explained about the door. Stella's expression grew troubled. "I should tell you something," she said after a moment. "I wasn't entirely truthful earlier, about Gerald and me." "You weren't just friends," Tuppence guessed. "No, we were involved. Nothing formal, nothing announced, but there was an understanding between us. He'd asked me to marry him the week before he died." Stella's voice caught. "I'd said yes." "Why didn't you mention this at dinner?" Tommy asked. "Because I didn't want Richard to know. He'd been trying to court me himself, you see, after he realized Gerald and I were close. I turned him down, but he was persistent, almost obsessively so." "How did Richard react when he learned about you and Gerald?" "I don't think he knew for certain. We were careful, but Gerald thought Richard suspected. He said Richard had become jealous and erratic." Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence. A picture was beginning to form. Richard Thorne, embezzling from the family estate. Gerald discovering the theft. Richard, desperate to prevent exposure, particularly as he'd been courting Stella. Gerald standing between him and everything he wanted. "Stella," Tommy said carefully, "do you know anything about a photograph?" She frowned. "What photograph?" "We're not sure, but Gerald may have found something significant among the family papers. A photograph that proved something important." "He did mention something," Stella said slowly. 2 days before I left for London, he said he'd found proof of something that had happened years ago. Something that would change everything. But he wouldn't tell me what it was. He said it was too dangerous. "Too dangerous," Tommy repeated. Those were his exact words. "Too dangerous for you to know yet, darling. But soon everyone will know. Soon I'll put things right." "Put things right," Tuppence murmured. He was going to expose something, or someone. "And 2 days later, he was dead," Diana said quietly. Tommy looked at the assembled faces. Diana's worried, Stella's grieving, Tuppence's thoughtful. Meadows stood in the doorway, his elderly face creased with concern. "I think," Tommy said, "we need to find that photograph, because I suspect it's the key to everything." "But where would Gerald have hidden it?" Diana asked. "If I wanted to hide something in this house," Tommy said, "somewhere safe but accessible, where would I put it?" "The safe," Diana said immediately. "In the study. It's where we keep important documents, jewelry, that sort of thing." "Can you open it?" "Yes, I have the combination." The study was a smaller, more intimate room than the library, with leather chairs and a coal fire that had burned down to embers. The safe was concealed behind a painting of Diana's grandfather, a stern-looking man with impressive mutton-chop whiskers. Diana worked the combination with practiced fingers. The safe opened with a solid click. Inside were the expected items: jewelry boxes, insurance papers, stock certificates. But tucked in the back, wrapped in brown paper, was a photograph. Tommy lifted it out carefully, unfolding the paper with gentle hands. The photograph was old, dating from the war years by the look of it. It showed a group of soldiers in uniform, standing outside what appeared to be a field hospital. Most of the faces meant nothing to Tommy, but one he recognized immediately. Richard Thorne, younger but unmistakable, standing with his arm around another soldier. But it wasn't Thorne that made Diana gasp. It was the soldier beside him, wearing a medical orderly's armband. "That's Dr. Waverley," she breathed. "But I thought he always said he served on the home front, that he was never in France." "Apparently not," Tommy said grimly. And on the back of the photograph, in Gerald's handwriting, was a single notation. Étaples, France, October 1918. The truth about Beatrice. Morning came with a soft mist rolling across the Sussex Downs, lending Ashcroft Manor an ethereal quality, as though it existed in some liminal space between past and present. Tommy woke early, his mind turning over the puzzle of the photograph and what it might mean. Étaples. He knew that name. It had been a major military hospital base during the war, treating casualties from the front lines. Thousands of men had passed through it. Thousands had died there. And somehow it held the key to Gerald Ashcroft's death. He found Tuppence already awake, sitting at the window of their room in her dressing gown, gazing out at the misty gardens. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Too many questions spinning round in my head." She looked up at him. Why would Dr. Waverley lie about serving in France? And what does any of that have to do with Beatrice dying of influenza in 1919? "I think," Tommy said slowly, "we need to have a conversation with Dr. Waverley. And possibly with Margaret. She wrote that letter questioning Richard's story about Beatrice's illness." The note said, "Ask them about the photograph," Tuppence pointed out. Them plural, so it's not just Waverley's secret. No. I suspect several people in this house know more than they're saying. They dressed and went down to breakfast, where they found Diana already at the table, looking as though she'd slept even less than they had. Stella joined them shortly after, subdued in a simple day dress. "I've been thinking about what Gerald said," Stella offered as she poured coffee. "About putting things right. What if he wasn't just talking about exposing theft or fraud? What if it was something bigger?" "What do you mean?" Diana asked. "Beatrice's death. The letter from your cousin Margaret. The photograph showing Waverley and Richard together in France." Stella counted the points on her fingers. "What if they're all connected? What if Beatrice didn't die of natural causes?" The words hung in the air like the morning mist outside. "That's a very serious accusation," Tommy said carefully. "Is it? The Spanish flu killed millions. One more death would hardly be questioned, would it? Particularly if the victim was already ill. But why?" Diana protested. "Why would anyone want to kill Beatrice?" "That's what we need to find out," Tuppence said. "Tommy, what do you know about Étaples?" "It was a hospital base. Massive place. Handled thousands of casualties. But it had a reputation." Tommy frowned, reaching back into memory. There was a mutiny there in 1917. The men were treated brutally by some of the officers and medical staff, and there were whispers of other things, medical experiments, morphine addiction among the staff, missing supplies. Gerald wrote the truth about Beatrice on the back of that photograph, Diana said. What if she learned something while visiting the hospital? What if that's why she died? Women didn't usually visit the front, Tommy pointed out. No, but Beatrice was a VAD nurse, Diana said suddenly. I'd forgotten. She volunteered in 1918, served for 6 months. She would have been at Étaples. The pieces were beginning to shift into a new configuration. Tommy could feel it, that familiar sensation of a case breaking open. So we have Beatrice, a VAD nurse at Etaples in 1918, he said, thinking aloud. Dr. Waverley was there, though he's never admitted it. Richard Thorne was there. And somehow, all of this connects to embezzled money and Gerald's death in 1925. "We need to speak to Waverley," Tuppence said firmly. "This morning." "And Margaret," Diana added. "She wrote that letter. She suspected something was wrong." They found Dr. Waverley at his surgery in the village, a neat brick building with a brass plate beside the door. The doctor's receptionist, a prim woman in her 50s, tried to tell them he was busy with patients, but Tuppence's determination was not easily thwarted. "Please inform the doctor that it concerns a matter of urgent importance regarding Gerald Ashcroft's death," she said firmly. "We'll wait." They were shown into Waverley's consulting room within 5 minutes. The doctor looked distinctly uncomfortable as they entered, his thin face pinched with what might have been anger or fear. "This is highly irregular," he said. "I have patience. You also have secrets," Tommy interrupted, placing the photograph on the desk between them. "Etaples, October 1918. You're in this photograph, Doctor. Yet you've always claimed you never served overseas." Waverley's face went white. For a long moment he said nothing, simply staring at the photograph as though it were a ghost risen from the past. "Where did you get this?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Gerald found it among the family papers, shortly before he died. I see." Waverley removed his spectacles, polishing them with shaking hands. "And you think what? That I killed Gerald to prevent this photograph from becoming public?" "Did you?" Tuppence asked bluntly. "No." The word was flat, definitive. "But I understand why you might think so. Yes, I was at Etaples. Yes, I've concealed that fact for years. But not because I committed any crime. Because I was a coward." "Explain," Tommy said. Waverley replaced his spectacles, his movements deliberate, as though composing himself. "I was a young doctor then, 28 years old, assigned to the hospital at Etaples. The things I saw there." He shook his head. "Men died by the hundreds. We worked 20-hour days, performed amputations without adequate anesthesia, made decisions about who would receive treatment and who would be left to die. And through it all, there was a senior medical officer, a Colonel Bradshaw, who was... Corrupt doesn't even begin to describe it. Corrupt how?" Tommy pressed. "Morphine. He was addicted to it, and he ensured a steady supply by diverting medical stores meant for the wounded. He had accomplices, orderlies, nurses, even other doctors. Anyone who objected was transferred, or, if they persisted, met with accidents." Waverley's hands trembled as he clasped them on his desk. "I knew what was happening. I saw it, but I said nothing. Because I was afraid." "And Beatrice?" Diana asked. "What about her?" "Beatrice was one of the VAD nurses. A good woman, compassionate, brave. She discovered what Bradshaw was doing. She confronted him, threatened to report him to the authorities." Waverley's voice cracked. "A week later, she was sent home on medical leave. She died of influenza before she could make her report." "You think Bradshaw killed her?" Tuppence said. "I don't know. Truly, I don't. The flu was rampant. She may have died naturally. But the timing was convenient. And Richard Thorne?" Tommy asked. "Where does he fit into this?" Waverley's expression hardened. "Richard was one of Bradshaw's men, one of the orderlies who helped divert the supplies. He made a small fortune from it, selling morphine on the black market. That's where his inheritance came from, blood money earned on the backs of dying soldiers." The room fell silent. Outside, they could hear the village going about its morning business. A cart rattling past, someone calling to a dog, the distant chime of church bells. Did Gerald know all of this? Tommy asked finally. He came to see me 3 days before Diana left for London. He'd found the photograph, done some research, put the pieces together. He said he was going to expose Richard, and he wanted me to corroborate the story. Waverley's voice was thick with shame. I refused. I told him I couldn't, that it would destroy my reputation, my practice, everything I'd built. So you left Gerald to confront Richard alone? Diana said, her voice cold. Yes. To my eternal shame, yes. Waverley looked at each of them in turn. But I didn't kill him. I'm a coward, but I'm not a murderer. And neither is Richard, at least not directly. What do you mean, not directly? Tuppence demanded. Richard was in London when Gerald died. You know that. You were there. Whatever happened to Gerald, Richard couldn't have physically killed him. Then who did? Diana asked. Waverley shook his head. I don't know, but I'll tell you this. Richard Thorne is a dangerous man. He's desperate and he has resources. If he wanted Gerald silenced, he would have found a way, alibi or no alibi. They left Waverley's surgery in troubled silence, walking back toward the village centre where Diana had parked her motor car. He's telling the truth, Tuppence said finally. About being a coward at least. Yes, Tommy agreed. But that doesn't mean he's told us everything. Where to now? Diana asked. To see your cousin Margaret, Tommy said. She wrote that letter questioning Richard's story. I think she knows more than she's admitted. Margaret and Robert Ashcroft lived in a tidy cottage on the edge of the village, with a garden that showed signs of careful tending. Margaret answered the door herself, her face registering surprise at seeing them. Diana and Mr. and Mrs. Beresford. I wasn't expecting. Won't you come in? The interior was cluttered but clean, filled with the accumulated possessions of a modest life. Margaret served tea with nervous hands, chattering about nothing, while Robert sat silently in an armchair, his expression unreadable. Margaret, Diana said finally, cutting through the pleasantries. We found a letter you wrote to my brother Anthony in 1919 about Beatrice and Richard. Margaret's teacup rattled as she set it down. Oh, that letter. You suspected Richard was lying about being with Beatrice when she fell ill? Tommy said. Why? It was just a feeling. Beatrice had written to me, you see, just before she became ill. She said Richard had been in London all that week on business. But when I mentioned it to Richard later, after she died, he insisted he'd been with her at the estate. I thought perhaps I'd misremembered. Or perhaps Richard was lying, Tuppence suggested gently. But why would he lie? Margaret's voice rose slightly. What difference did it make where he was? Unless, Tommy said slowly, he needed an alibi for something else, something that happened while Beatrice was dying. Robert stirred in his chair. This is all ancient history. It has nothing to do with Gerald's death, doesn't it? Tommy turned to face him. Gerald was investigating the past. He discovered Richard's wartime activities. And days later, Gerald was dead. Richard was in London, Robert said stubbornly. Diana saw him there. Yes, Tommy agreed. Which is indeed the puzzle, isn't it? They left the cottage no more enlightened than before, except for one crucial fact. Everyone in this village knew more about Richard Thorne than they were willing to admit, and everyone, it seemed, was afraid of him. As they drove back to Ashcroft Manor, Tommy found himself thinking about alibis, about the impossibility of being in two places at once, unless, of course, one wasn't. Tuppence, he said suddenly. What if we're looking at this all wrong? What do you mean? As we're trying to figure out how Richard could have killed Gerald while being in London. But what if the question isn't how, but through whom? Tuppence's eyes widened. You think he had an accomplice? I think it's the only explanation that makes sense. Richard provides himself with an unbreakable alibi, while someone else does the actual killing. But who? Diana asked from the driver's seat. That was the question, Tommy thought. Who in Ashcroft Manor had a reason to help Richard Thorne commit murder? And more importantly, were they still in danger? They returned to Ashcroft Manor to find an unwelcome visitor waiting. Richard Thorne stood in the entrance hall, his motorcar visible through the open front door, Meadows hovering uncertainly nearby. "Diana," Thorne said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I've just had a most unpleasant visit from Dr. Waverley. He tells me you've been digging into matters that are none of your concern." "Gerald's death is very much my concern," Diana replied coolly. "Gerald's death was an accident. The police didn't know about Tuppence." Tommy interrupted, stepping forward. "They didn't know about the morphine trafficking, or the money you stole from the Ashcroft estate." Thorne's face flushed dangerously. I don't know what lies Waverley has been telling you." "Not just Waverley," Tuppence said. "We've seen the bank records, the photograph, Gerald's notes." For a moment Thorne seemed to deflate, his shoulders sagging. Then he straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, harder, more desperate. "Yes, all right. I took money from the estate during the war. I sold morphine. I did things I'm not proud of. But that was 7 years ago. I was a different person then. Were you?" Tommy asked. "Or did you simply learn to hide it better?" "I didn't kill Gerald." Thorne's eyes were intense, almost pleading. "You have to believe me. I couldn't have. I was in London." "So you keep saying," Tuppence observed. "Because it's true. Ask Diana. Ask Marcus Thornley, who hosted the dinner. Ask any of the guests. I never left that house." "Then who did kill Gerald?" Diana demanded. "Because someone did, Richard. Someone pushed him down those stairs. I don't know." Thorne ran a hand through his hair, disheveling it. "But it wasn't me. Gerald was my friend, was he?" Tommy asked quietly. "Because from where I'm standing, Gerald was about to expose you. To ruin you. That's hardly friendly behavior. He was going to give me a chance to make things right," Thorne said, his voice cracking. "That's what he told me when we spoke on the telephone. He said if I repaid the money, if I helped him expose Bradshaw's network, he wouldn't go to the police about my part in it. He was giving me a chance at redemption." "And you expect us to believe you were grateful for that?" Tuppence asked skeptically. "I was. Gerald was offering me a way out. Why would I kill him?" It was, Tommy had to admit, a fair question. If Thorne was telling the truth about Gerald's offer, he'd have had no reason to want him dead. But was he telling the truth? "Mr. Thorne," Meadows interrupted from the doorway, his voice apologetic. "I'm sorry, but there's a telephone call for you." "They said it was urgent." Thorne hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Diana, please, you must believe me. I didn't kill Gerald." He followed Meadows toward the study where the telephone was kept, leaving Tommy, Tuppence, and Diana standing in the hall. "Do you believe him?" Diana asked quietly. "I don't know," Tommy admitted. "His story has a certain logic to it. But—" He was interrupted by a shout from the direction of the study, followed by the sound of breaking glass. They rushed down the hall to find the study door hanging open. Thorne standing in the middle of the room, his face white with shock. The window had been shattered, shards of glass scattered across the carpet, and embedded in the far wall, still quivering slightly, was a knife. "Someone threw it through the window," Thorne said, his voice shaking. "While I was reaching for the telephone. If I'd been standing 6 inches to the left." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The knife would have struck him instead of the wall. Tommy moved quickly to the window, careful not to step on the glass. The garden outside was empty, but the shrubbery showed signs of recent disturbance. Someone had been hiding there, waiting. "Did you see anyone?" he asked. Thorne shook his head. "Just a shadow. Moving fast." Tuppence had retrieved the knife, holding it carefully by the handle. It was an ordinary kitchen knife, the kind that could be found in any household. But wrapped around the blade was a piece of paper, secured with string. She unfolded it carefully. The message, like the previous note, was in printed block capitals. "Stop asking questions, or the next knife finds its mark." Diana sank into a chair, her face pale. "This has gone too far. Someone tried to kill Richard. Or tried to frighten him," Tommy said. "A warning shot, if you will, but who?" Tuppence demanded. "Who benefits from keeping us quiet?" "That," Tommy said grimly, "is what we need to find out. And quickly, before whoever threw this knife decides to make good on their threat." Thorne had recovered some of his composure. "I'm leaving. Going back to London where it's safe." "Running away?" Diana asked. "Call it what you like. I'm not staying here to be murdered in my bed." Thorne moved toward the door, then paused. "Diana, for what it's worth, I am sorry. About the money, about everything. Gerald was a better man than I ever was." After he'd gone, the three of them stood in the damaged study, trying to make sense of what had happened. "The knife could have killed him," Tuppence said slowly. "But it didn't. It missed by a considerable margin." "Deliberately?" Tommy wondered. "A warning rather than an actual attempt? Or poor aim?" Diana suggested. "No," Tommy said, examining the knife's trajectory. "Whoever threw this knew what they were doing. They could have hit Thorne if they'd wanted to. This was meant to frighten, not to kill. But why warn him at all?" Tuppence asked. "If someone wants to stop our investigation, why not just let us believe Richard is the murderer and close the case?" "Because," Tommy said slowly, "maybe Richard isn't the murderer. Maybe whoever killed Gerald needs us to keep investigating, to keep following the wrong trail, while they cover their tracks." "That doesn't make sense," Diana protested. "Why send us notes? Why throw knives?" "To control the investigation," Tommy explained. "The first note told us about the photograph. Why? Because they wanted us to focus on Richard and his wartime activities. The knife warning reinforces that. It makes Richard look like the victim, the one being threatened." "You're saying someone is manipulating us," Tuppence said. "I'm saying it's possible." They were interrupted by Meadows appearing in the doorway, his elderly face troubled. "Miss Diana, I'm sorry to disturb you, but Miss Stella has asked to speak with you. She's quite upset." They found Stella in her room, pacing like a caged animal, her hair dishevelled. "I remembered something," she said as soon as they entered, "about the night Gerald died. Something he said to me the day before." "What?" Diana asked. "He said, if anything happens to me, look for the second photograph. It's the proof you'll need." "I didn't think anything of it at the time. I thought he was being melodramatic. But now, there's another photograph," Tommy said. "Hidden somewhere, but where?" Tuppence wondered. Stella shook her head. "He didn't say. Just look for it, as though I'd know where to find it." "The library," Diana said suddenly. "That's where Gerald spent all his time. If he hid something, it would be there." They returned to the library, that room that had already yielded so many secrets. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the books. "Where would you hide a photograph in a library?" Tuppence mused. "In a book," Tommy said. "It's the most obvious place. But which book? There were thousands of volumes here, from floor to ceiling." "Think logically," Tuppence said. Gerald was systematic. If he wanted Stella to find it, he'd put it somewhere meaningful, somewhere she'd think to look. A favourite book? Diana suggested. No, Stella said slowly. Not a favourite. He once told me that if he ever wrote his memoirs, he'd call them The Truth at Last. He said it was a title that would make sense one day. Truth. Tommy's eyes travelled along the shelves, scanning titles. Philosophy, history, novels, and then he saw it, near the bottom shelf, in a section of Victorian poetry. A slim volume titled Truth at Last, by an obscure poet named Frederick Langbridge. He pulled it from the shelf and opened it carefully. Tucked into the centre pages was another photograph. This one showed the interior of what appeared to be a military hospital. In the foreground, a medical officer was bent over a desk, apparently signing papers. The officer's face was partially visible, enough to identify Colonel Bradshaw. Waverley had called him, the corrupt medical officer at Etaples. But it was the background of the photograph that made Tommy catch his breath. Partially obscured by shadows, but still identifiable if one looked closely, were two figures engaged in conversation, Richard Thorne and Dr. Waverley. And standing slightly apart, watching them with an expression of dawning horror, was a young nurse in a VAD uniform to Beatrice on the back, in Gerald's handwriting. The night before Beatrice died. She knew. This is it, Diana breathed. The proof Gerald mentioned. Proof of what, though? Tuppence asked. Tommy studied the photograph carefully. Proof that Beatrice discovered the morphine ring. That she confronted them about it. And proof of who was there when she did it. Richard and Waverley, Stella said. We already knew they were involved. Yes, Tommy agreed. But look more carefully. There's someone else in this photograph. Someone we haven't considered. He pointed to a shadow in the far corner of the image. It was barely visible, but the outline suggested another figure, watching the scene unfold. Diana leaned closer, squinting at the image. Then her face went white. No, she whispered. It can't be. Who is it? Tuppence demanded. Diana looked up at them, her eyes wide with shock and sudden understanding. It's Meadows, she said. Our butler. Meadows was at Etaples too. The revelation about Meadows changed everything. The faithful family retainer, who had served the Ashcrofts for 40 years, had been present at the scene of Beatrice's confrontation with the morphine ring, and he had never mentioned it. We need to speak with him, Tommy said. But Diana shook her head. Meadows has been like family. There must be an explanation. There is, came a voice from the doorway. They turned to find Meadows himself standing there, his elderly face composed but sad. I knew this day would come eventually, when the past finally caught up with the present. You were at Etaples, Tommy said. I was. I served as a batman to Colonel Bradshaw. A terrible man, but I had no choice. One didn't question orders during the war. Meadows moved into the room with the careful dignity that arthritis imposed. I saw many things there, terrible things, including Beatrice's confrontation with the morphine ring, Tuppence said. Yes, she was a brave young woman. Too brave, perhaps. She threatened to report them all. Bradshaw, Thorne, the others. She said she had written everything down, that she would send her report to the War Office. What happened? Diana asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Meadows was silent for a long moment. She became ill, very suddenly. The influenza, they said, but... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Colonel Bradshaw had access to many medications. Some of them could produce symptoms similar to influenza. And Beatrice's illness came on very quickly, very conveniently, less than 24 hours after her confrontation. You think they poisoned her, Tommy said. I think it's possible. I have no proof, of course. And by the time anyone might have suspected foul play, she was already gone, buried, and the war was ending. These things got lost in the chaos. Why didn't you say something? Diana demanded, her voice breaking. All these years you knew Richard Thorne might have murdered Beatrice, and you said nothing. Because I was afraid, Miss Diana. Afraid for my position, afraid for my life. Men like Colonel Bradshaw had long reaches, and after the war, when Richard Thorne started visiting the estate, becoming close to your family, what could I say? That I suspected him of murder based on nothing more than coincidence and timing. Gerald figured it out, Stella said. That's why he died, Meadows nodded slowly. When Mr. Gerald started going through the old papers, finding the photographs, I knew it was only a matter of time. He came to me, asked me about it to Bill. I told him what I knew, or most of it. Most of it? Tommy asked sharply. I told him about the morphine ring, about Beatrice's confrontation. But I didn't tell him everything. What didn't you tell him? Meadows looked at each of them in turn. His old eyes filled with regret. I didn't tell him about the other person who was at Etaples, the person who had even more reason than Richard Thorne to want Beatrice silenced. The room fell silent. Even the ticking of the mantel clock seemed to fade into nothing. Who? Diana asked. Dr. Waverley wasn't just a doctor at Etaples, Meadows said quietly. He was Colonel Bradshaw's right hand. He helped organize the morphine diversion, kept the records, ensured that supplies were properly redirected. Richard Thorne was just a soldier, a small cog in the machine, but Waverley was central to it all. Waverley told us he was a coward, Tuppence said, that he knew what was happening but was too afraid to stop it. That's what he wants you to believe, but I saw the truth. Dr. Waverley profited greatly from that morphine. He used his share to establish his practice here in the village after the war. Everything he has, everything he is, was built on blood money. Tommy's mind was racing. Gerald confronted Waverley. That's why Waverley looked so shaken when we spoke to him this morning. He wasn't just afraid of having his cowardice exposed. He was afraid of being revealed as a murderer. But Waverley has no alibi, Diana protested. Unlike Richard, he wasn't in London the night Gerald died. He could have been here. Exactly, Tommy said softly. The pieces were falling into place now, the picture becoming clearer. But there were still gaps, still questions that needed answers. Meadows, Tommy said. Where were you the night Gerald died? In my cottage behind the house. I retired early, around 8 o'clock. My arthritis had been troubling me, and I took some medicine that made me quite drowsy. I didn't wake until morning. Did anyone see you? Can anyone confirm you were in your cottage all night? Mrs. Cratchit brought me a posset around 7:30. After that, I was alone. Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence. An old man, alone, medicated, with no one to verify his whereabouts. It wasn't proof of guilt, but it wasn't proof of innocence either. We need to reconstruct that night, Tuppence said. Every detail. Who was where, when, and why. Diana moved to her desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. Let me write it down. Diana, that's me, left for London at 3 o'clock. Arrived at Marcus Thornley's house at 5. Richard was already there, having driven up separately. We had drinks, then dinner at 7. After dinner we played bridge until past midnight. And Gerald? Tommy prompted. Gerald was here. Meadows served him dinner at 7:30. He always ate in the library when he was working. After that, Diana paused. We don't actually know, do we? No one saw him alive after Meadows left him his dinner tray. What time did Meadows leave the library? 7:45, Meadows said. I offered to stay in case Mr. Gerald needed anything, but he dismissed me, said he had work to do and didn't want to be disturbed. And the library door was locked from the inside, Tommy mused. When did you try to enter the next morning? At 7 o'clock as usual. I brought Mr. Gerald his morning tea and found the door locked. When he didn't respond to my knocking, I fetched the spare key. That's when I found him. Time of death was estimated between 8 and 11 the previous evening, Tuppence recalled. So Gerald was killed sometime between 7:45, when Meadows left him, and 11 o'clock. A window of just over 3 hours, Tommy said, during which time Diana and Richard were definitely in London. Meadows was in his cottage, and Dr. Waverley... "I wasn't here," came a voice from the doorway. They turned to find Dr. Waverley standing in the entrance to the library, his face pale but determined. "I knew you'd work it out eventually," he said, moving into the room. "I wasn't at the surgery that evening. I told my receptionist I was visiting a patient in Brighton. But that was a lie. Where were you?" Tommy demanded. "I was here, at Ashcroft Manor." Waverley's voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly. "Gerald had asked me to come. He wanted to discuss the morphine ring, to get my full confession. He said if I cooperated, he'd try to keep my name out of it as much as possible." "So, you came here that night?" Diana said slowly. "You were alone with Gerald in the library?" "Yes, we talked for nearly 2 hours. I told him everything. About Bradshaw, about the morphine, about Beatrice. How she'd threatened to expose us all, and how Bradshaw had arranged her death to look like influenza. I gave Gerald all the details he needed, and then," Tommy asked quietly, "and then I left. At 9:15. Gerald was alive when I left him. He was planning to spend another hour or two organizing his notes. He said he'd contact the authorities in the morning." "Can anyone corroborate this?" Tuppence asked. "No. I left through the servants' entrance, as Gerald suggested. He didn't want anyone to know I'd been here until he was ready to make his allegations public. I drove home, went straight to bed. No one saw me." "How convenient," Stella said coldly. "It's the truth." Waverley's voice rose slightly. "I didn't kill Gerald. Why would I? I'd already confessed everything to him. The damage was done. Unless," Tommy said, "you had second thoughts. Unless you realized that once Gerald made his allegations public, your life was over. Your practice, your reputation, everything. I didn't kill him." Waverley's composure was cracking now. "I'm a doctor. I took an oath to do no harm." "You harmed Beatrice," Diana said quietly. "You stood by while she was murdered. That was different. I was young, afraid, caught up in something I couldn't control." "And 7 years later," Tommy said, "you had the chance to make it right. But instead, you let history repeat itself." The accusation hung in the air. Waverley opened his mouth to protest again. But before he could speak, there was a sudden crash from somewhere upstairs, followed by a scream. They rushed from the library, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The scream had come from Stella's room. Tommy reached the door first, throwing it open. The room was in disarray. Drawers pulled open, their contents scattered across the floor. The window stood open, curtains billowing in the evening breeze. And Stella was gone. On the floor, where she must have dropped it in her struggle, was a handkerchief. Tommy picked it up, noting the embroidered initials in one corner. R.T. Richard Thorne. "He's taken her," Diana breathed. "Richard has taken Stella." But Tommy was frowning at the handkerchief, something not quite right about the scene. The open window, the scattered belongings, the convenient clue. It looked, he thought, a little too perfect, a little too staged, like someone wanted them to think Richard had taken Stella. When in fact, "Tuppence," he said urgently, "check the grounds now, and take Meadows with you." As they hurried from the room, Tommy turned to Diana and Waverley. "I think," he said slowly, "it's time we had a proper conversation about what really happened the night Gerald died. Because unless I'm very much mistaken, we've all been looking at this backwards from the very beginning." An hour later, they were gathered in the drawing room, all of them at Tommy's insistence. Tuppence had found Stella unharmed in the garden maze, confused and frightened, but physically whole. She'd been led there, she said, by a note slipped under her door claiming to be from Gerald, written before his death. Richard Thorne had been summoned from his London lodgings by urgent telegram. He'd arrived in a fury, demanding to know why his handkerchief had been used to stage a false kidnapping. Margaret and Robert had been fetched from their cottage. Dr. Waverley had remained at the manor, too shaken by the afternoon's revelations to leave. Now they all sat in careful positions around the drawing room, watching Tommy as he stood by the fireplace, arranging his thoughts. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to establish one absolute fact. Richard Thorne did not kill Gerald Ashcroft." "I could have told you that," Thorne said bitterly. "Yes, you did tell us, repeatedly, but it's taken me rather too long to believe you." Tommy glanced at Diana. "Your cousin was right about one thing. Someone with an unbreakable alibi killed Gerald. But she was wrong about who." "Then who did kill him?" Diana demanded. "I'll get to that. But first, let's review what we know. 7 years ago, at the military hospital at Etaples, a morphine trafficking ring operated under the direction of Colonel Bradshaw. Richard Thorne was involved, as was Dr. Waverley. A nurse named Beatrice discovered their activities and threatened to expose them. Shortly thereafter, she died of what appeared to be influenza. "I never claimed to be innocent of that," Thorne said quietly, "though I swear I didn't know Bradshaw planned to kill her. I thought she'd simply been transferred." "Moving on," Tommy continued. "Gerald Ashcroft, while researching family papers, discovered photographs and documents relating to Etaples. He pieced together what had happened to Beatrice and confronted both Richard and Dr. Waverley. He offered Richard a chance at redemption and secured a full confession from Dr. Waverley. All of which is true, Waverley confirmed. But here's where it gets interesting. Gerald was killed in a locked library. The door was locked from the inside, the key in his pocket. The only way in or out was through the door, and yet no one could have entered or left without being seen. "Unless they were already in the room," Tuppence said softly, picking up her cue. "Exactly. Gerald didn't fall from the upper gallery because someone pushed him. He fell because he was already dead or dying, and his body was arranged to look like an accident." "That's impossible," Diana protested. "Dr. Waverley said the injuries were consistent with a fall." "Dr. Waverley," Tommy said, turning to the doctor. "How easy would it be to mistake injuries caused by a fall for injuries caused by, say, throwing a dead body down a flight of stairs?" Waverley's face went pale. "Theoretically, if the body were positioned correctly, it could be done. But the timing... "The timing is crucial," Tommy agreed. "The murderer had to be certain Gerald would be in the library alone that evening. They had to know Diana would be in London, that Meadows would retire early. They had to have access to the house, to the library, and they had to be able to lock the door from the inside after they'd finished." "But how?" Margaret asked. "Even if someone killed Gerald and staged the fall, how did they get out of a locked room?" "They didn't," Tuppence said. "That's the brilliant part. They were never in the room during the murder." "You're talking in riddles," Robert said impatiently. "Let me put it simply," Tommy said. "Gerald Ashcroft was poisoned. He took his evening tea at 7:45, consumed the poison unknowingly, and died somewhere around 8 o'clock. After he died, the murderer entered the library using a key. Not the main key, but a key they'd had made in advance. They moved Gerald's body to the base of the stairs, arranged it to look like a fall, locked the door from the inside, and left through the window, securing it from outside. But the window wasn't damaged, Diana objected. How could someone lock it from outside? Fishing line, Tuppence said. Threaded through the window latch, pulled tight from outside, then the line removed. It's an old trick but effective. And the key? Thorne asked. How did they get Gerald's key into his pocket? It was already there, Tommy said. The murderers simply left their duplicate key somewhere to be found later, creating the illusion that the library had been locked from the inside all along. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. You're saying someone in this house killed Gerald? Stella said, her voice shaking. Was someone who had access to his tea, who knew his routines, who could move about the house without suspicion? Yes, Tommy said quietly. Someone who had been watching and planning for days, waiting for the perfect opportunity. But who? Diana demanded. Who would... She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening as realization dawned. No, she breathed. Not. I'm afraid so, Tommy said gently. The person who killed Gerald Ashcroft, who staged his death to look like an accident, who had both means and opportunity. Was me, came a voice from the doorway. They turned as one to see Mrs. Cratchit, the cook, standing in the entrance. She was a stout woman in her 60s, normally cheerful, but now her face was set in hard lines. I killed Mr. Gerald, she said calmly, and I'd do it again. For a moment, no one moved. Then Tuppence rose slowly from her chair. You poisoned his tea, she said. You had access to his routine. You knew when he took his evening refreshment. You put something in the tea that would kill him quietly, without suspicion. Digitalis, Mrs. Cratchit said. From the foxgloves in the garden, I ground the leaves into powder, mixed it with his usual tea. He never suspected. But why? Diana's voice was anguished. Why would you kill Gerald? Mrs. Cratchit's face twisted with old pain and fury. Because he killed my daughter. Because Beatrice was my child, and he stood by while those men murdered her. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Beatrice, the VAD nurse who died at Etaples, had been Mrs. Cratchit's daughter. You were engaged to Richard Thorne, Mrs. Cratchit said to Stella, though her eyes remained on Tommy and Tuppence. But before that, Beatrice was engaged to him. She was my beautiful, brave girl, and she died because she tried to do the right thing. But Gerald didn't kill Beatrice, Thorne protested. He wasn't even at Etaples. He knew, Mrs. Cratchit said simply. Mr. Anthony told him everything in 1920 in a letter before he died. He knew Richard Thorne and Dr. Waverley were involved in Beatrice's death, and he kept silent. He let them walk free, let them become respectable, let them live, while my daughter rotted in the ground. That's not true, Diana said desperately. Anthony never knew. He couldn't have. He knew. And he told Gerald to keep silent, to protect the family reputation. The Ashcrofts always protect their own, don't they? Even the ones who don't deserve protecting. You've been planning this for years, Tommy said quietly. Ever since Gerald came back to the manor, you waited for your chance, and when he started investigating Etaples, started digging up the past, you knew he'd discover the truth. You couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let him profit from exposing Richard and Waverley while keeping his own family's complicity secret. Mrs. Cratchit corrected. He was going to be the hero, the man who brought justice for Beatrice, while hiding the fact that he'd known for years and done nothing. So you killed him, Stella said, her voice hollow. I gave him what he deserved. Justice, after all these years. And the notes? Tuppence asked. The knife thrown at Richard? I wanted you to investigate. I wanted everyone to know what Richard and Waverley had done. But I also wanted to protect myself. The notes pointed you toward the truth, but the knife made me look like a victim, not a perpetrator. You planted Richard's handkerchief in Stella's room, Tommy said, and wrote the note luring her to the garden. I needed to create confusion, to make you doubt your own theories. Mrs. Cratchit's face was calm, almost serene. But I see I underestimated you, Mr. Beresford. You worked it out after all. Not quite fast enough, Tommy admitted. I should have seen it sooner. The way you accidentally broke that serving dish at dinner. You were listening at the door, heard us discussing the case, and needed to cover your presence. The servant's entrance being found unlocked. That was you, going in and out to deliver notes and stage scenes. Mrs. Cratchit nodded. I won't run. I've done what I set out to do. Let the police come. There's just one thing I don't understand, Tuppence said. Why go to all this trouble? Why not simply poison Gerald and leave it at that? Why stage the fall? Mrs. Cratchit's expression softened slightly. Because I wanted him to die the same way Beatrice did. Alone, helpless. His death dismissed as an accident or natural causes. I wanted him to feel that same terror, that same abandonment. Beatrice died alone in a hospital ward, with no one to hold her hand, while the men who killed her watched and did nothing. I wanted Gerald to die alone in his library, with no one to help him, while I watched and did nothing. The cold calculation of it, the patient revenge, sent a chill through the room. You could have exposed them, Diana said, tears streaming down her face. You could have gone to the police, told them what you knew. Who would have believed the cook? I had no proof, only the word of a grieving mother. No, this was better. This was justice. Meadows appeared in the doorway. Miss Diana, the police are here. I took the liberty of telephoning them when I heard Mrs. Cratchit's confession. As two constables led Mrs. Cratchit away, the assembled group sat in stunned silence. 7 years of secrets, of guilt and complicity, of revenge carefully planned and executed. She's right about one thing, Richard Thorne said quietly. We all stood by. We all let Beatrice die to protect ourselves. In a way, we're all guilty. But we didn't kill anyone, Waverley protested weakly. Didn't we? Thorne stood, straightening his jacket. I'm going to turn myself in. Tell the police everything about Ataples, about the morphine ring, about Beatrice. It won't bring her back. But perhaps it's time the truth came out. I'll go with you, Waverley said after a long pause. It's long past time I stopped being a coward. After they'd left, Diana turned to Tommy and Tuppence. Thank you, she said simply, for finding the truth. I'm not sure the truth was worth finding, Tuppence said gently. Sometimes the past is better left buried. No, Diana said firmly. Mrs. Cratchit was wrong to kill Gerald, but she was right about one thing. The Ashcrofts have been protecting guilty secrets for too long. It's time we faced what we've become. Tommy nodded, understanding. Justice, he'd learned long ago, wasn't always satisfying. Sometimes it was simply necessary. The police inspector who arrived to take statements was a thorough man named Bradshaw. No relation to the colonel, he assured them, who spent 3 hours interviewing everyone present. Mrs. Cratchit had been taken to the local constabulary, where she sat calmly awaiting formal charges. It should have been over. The case solved, the murderess confessed. But as Tommy sat in the library that evening, something continued to nag at him. You're brooding, Tuppence observed, settling into the chair beside him. Thinking, he corrected. Same thing in your case. What's troubling you? Mrs. Cratchit's confession. It was too neat, too complete. She was planning it for years, Tommy. She had every detail worked out. Exactly. Every detail, Tommy stood, beginning to pace. How did she know Gerald would be alone in the library that night? How did she know Diana would be in London? That Meadows would retire early? Those weren't things she could have planned months in advance. Tuppence frowned. Are you suggesting... I'm suggesting that Mrs. Cratchit had help, or at least someone gave her the opportunity she needed. Who? Before Tommy could answer, there was a knock at the library door. Stella entered, her face pale but determined. I need to tell you something, she said without preamble. Something I should have mentioned earlier, but I was afraid. Go on, Tommy said gently. The day before Gerald died, he told me he'd received a letter, an anonymous letter warning him that someone in the house meant him harm. He laughed it off, said it was probably someone playing a joke. Do you know what happened to this letter? He said he'd burned it, said he didn't want Diana worrying over nothing. Tommy and Tuppence exchanged glances. An anonymous warning letter, sent just before Gerald's death, warning him, or perhaps setting up an alibi for what was to come. Stella? Tuppence asked carefully. Did Gerald tell you who he suspected might have written it? He didn't take it seriously, but he did mention that the handwriting looked similar to something he'd seen recently. Something in the family papers. Tommy moved quickly to the estate room, pulling out the folders they'd examined before. He spread the documents across the work table, studying each piece of handwriting carefully. And then he saw it. A note attached to one of the property deeds, dated just 3 weeks earlier. The handwriting was careful, controlled, but beneath the control, the same distinctive loops and flourishes as the block capitals used in the anonymous notes. Tuppence, he said quietly. Fetch Diana. And Meadows. I think we need to have another conversation. 20 minutes later, they were once again assembled in the drawing room. Diana looked exhausted, her elegant composure finally cracking. Meadows stood by the door, his elderly face impassive. There's something we've all been overlooking, Tommy began. Mrs. Cratchit couldn't have acted entirely alone. She needed inside information. Gerald's routines, the household schedule, Diana's plans to go to London. She needed someone to ensure everything went according to plan. What are you saying? Diana asked. I'm saying Mrs. Cratchit had an accomplice. Someone in this house who wanted Gerald dead almost as much as she did. Meadows stirred. Mr. Beresford, I must object. Not you, Meadows, Tommy said gently. Though I can understand why you'd think so. No. The accomplice had to be someone who knew the family's secrets, who had access to the estate documents, who could manipulate circumstances without raising suspicion. He pulled out the property deed with its attached note, holding it up for all to see. This note is in your handwriting, Diana. But more importantly, so were the anonymous notes we've been receiving. You wanted us to investigate, but you also wanted to control what we discovered. Diana's face went white. That's absurd. Why would I? Because you knew, Tuppence said softly, completing the thought. You knew about your brother Anthony's complicity in covering up Beatrice's death. You knew that if we investigated Gerald's murder, we'd eventually uncover your family's guilty secret. So you brought us in, guided us toward Richard and Waverley, away from the truth about the Ashcrofts. But I'm the one who invited you here, Diana protested. I'm the one who insisted Gerald's death wasn't an accident. Yes, Tommy agreed, because you knew Mrs. Cratchit had killed him. You'd suspected for some time that she blamed your family for Beatrice's death. When Gerald died so conveniently, you put the pieces together. But instead of going to the police, you saw an opportunity. An opportunity for what? To expose Richard and Waverley's crimes while keeping your family's involvement hidden. You fed Mrs. Cratchit information about Gerald's routines, about your plans to be in London that night. You ensured she'd have the opportunity she needed, and then you brought in investigators who would follow the trail you laid out for them. Diana stood abruptly, her hands shaking. You can't prove any of this, can't I? Tommy gestured to the notes spread on the table. Your handwriting is distinctive, Diana. Even when you try to disguise it in block capitals, certain formations give you away. And there's something else. Mrs. Cratchit mentioned that Anthony wrote to Gerald in 1920, telling him about Beatrice's death. But how would Mrs. Cratchit know about a private letter between brothers unless someone told her? You gave her that information, Tuppence said. You found your brother's correspondence after he died, discovered his complicity in covering up Beatrice's murder, and when Mrs. Cratchit expressed her suspicions about Gerald, you confirmed them. You weaponized her grief. Diana sank back into her chair, all fight draining from her. I didn't kill anyone, she whispered. I couldn't let the Ashcroft name be destroyed. Not after Anthony worked so hard to protect it. So, you let Mrs. Cratchit become a murderer, Tommy said quietly. You gave her the means and opportunity, knowing what she would do. That makes you an accessory, Diana. Will you turn me in? Diana asked, looking up at them with tear-filled eyes. Tommy and Tuppence exchanged a long look, a conversation passing between them in silence. That's not our decision to make, Tommy said finally. But I think you need to tell the police everything. Mrs. Cratchit is facing murder charges. She deserves to have the full story told. She'll implicate me. Probably. But at least you'll have told the truth. Perhaps that's worth something. Diana stood, straightening her shoulders with visible effort. Very well. Meadows, would you call Inspector Bradshaw? Tell him I have additional information about Gerald's death. As Meadows moved to the telephone, Diana turned to Tommy and Tuppence. I didn't want this, she said quietly. I didn't want any of this. But when I realized what Anthony had done, how he'd protected a murderer to save the family reputation, I couldn't let Gerald do the same thing. I couldn't let him expose Richard and Waverley while hiding our own guilt. So you let Mrs. Cratchit kill him, Stella said, her voice thick with disgust. You let her take the blame while you played the grieving cousin. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought, Diana's voice broke, I thought I was protecting what mattered. You were protecting a lie, Tommy said. And lies, Diana, have a way of destroying everything they touch. Inspector Bradshaw arrived within the hour. Diana gave her full confession, admitting to providing Mrs. Cratchit with information about Gerald's routines and confirming the cook's suspicions about the Ashcroft family's complicity in covering up Beatrice's death. She was formally charged as an accessory to murder. As they watched the police car drive away with Diana in the back seat, Tuppence turned to Tommy. Do you think she really believed she was doing the right thing? I think she convinced herself of it, Tommy replied. That's the danger of family pride, of putting reputation above truth. Eventually, you lose sight of the difference between protecting what you love and protecting what you should condemn. Will Mrs. Cratchit's sentence be reduced, now that Diana's involvement is known? Perhaps, though I doubt it will matter much to her. She got what she wanted, justice for Beatrice, and the exposure of everyone who contributed to her daughter's death, even Diana. They stood in silence, watching the evening shadows lengthen across the grounds of Ashcroft Manor. I keep thinking about Beatrice, Tuppence said quietly. A young woman trying to do the right thing, destroyed by men who cared more about profit than principle. And then, 7 years later, her death still causing destruction. The past never really dies, Tommy observed. It just waits, sometimes for justice, sometimes for revenge. The trick is knowing which is which. Stella approached from the house, a small suitcase in hand. "I'm leaving," she said. "I can't stay here. Not after everything. Where will you go?" Tuppence asked gently. "London, I suppose. Start over. Try to forget." She paused, then added, "Gerald would have hated all this, you know. The lies, the manipulation. He just wanted the truth to come out. And it did," Tommy said, though not in the way he intended. After Stella had departed, Tommy and Tuppence remained on the terrace, neither quite ready to return to the house where so much tragedy had unfolded. "We should go," Tuppence said finally. "There's nothing more we can do here." "No," Tommy agreed, "though I suspect this case will haunt us for a while yet." "Most of them do," Tuppence said. "The ones that matter, anyway." They returned inside to pack their belongings, leaving Ashcroft Manor to its ghosts and secrets. Behind them, Meadows closed the front door with a soft click, the sound of a chapter ending. Tomorrow, they would return to London, to their ordinary life. But tonight, they carried with them the weight of truth. How it could save and destroy in equal measure. How pursuing it sometimes meant losing more than one bargained for. The unbreakable alibi had been broken after all. But in the breaking, they'd learned that some mysteries went deeper than simple questions of who and how. They touched on why. The most difficult question of all. 3 weeks later, Tommy and Tuppence sat in their favourite cafe in Kensington, a cosy establishment with chintz curtains and excellent scones. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. "I see Mrs. Cratchit's trial is set for next month," Tuppence said, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. "And Diana is to be tried as an accessory." Tommy replied, not looking up from his crossword puzzle. 7 across, 6 letters. Ancient retribution. Justice. No, that was 7 letters. Richard Thorne and Dr. Waverley have both made full confessions about their involvement in the morphine ring at Etaples. Tuppence continued. They're cooperating with the War Office investigation into Colonel Bradshaw's activities. "Good for them," Tommy murmured. "Bit late, but better than never." "You're not listening to me." "I am. Ancient retribution, 6 letters. Any thoughts?" "Nemesis," Tuppence said immediately. "Tommy, are you at all interested in the resolution of the case we spent 2 weeks investigating?" Tommy set down his pencil and looked at his wife with fond exasperation. "Of course I am, dear. But what is there to say? Mrs. Cratchit will likely hang for murder. Diana will serve time as an accessory. Richard and Waverley will face courts-martial for their wartime activities. Justice, after a fashion, will be served. But are you satisfied with it?" "Satisfied?" Tommy considered the question carefully. "No, I don't think I am. Beatrice is still dead. Gerald is still dead. Mrs. Cratchit will be dead soon. A great deal of death and misery, all stemming from choices made during the war by frightened people trying to survive." "You sound almost sympathetic to them." "Not sympathetic exactly, but I understand how it happens. The small compromises that lead to larger ones. The lies that become so entrenched you can't remember the truth. We all make choices during wartime that we wouldn't make in peace." Tuppence reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Tommy had his own war memories, his own compromises. They didn't speak of them often, but they were always there, just beneath the surface. "Well," she said, deliberately brightening her tone, "at least we solved the mystery of the unbreakable alibi. That was rather clever of you, working out the poisoned tea and the staged fall." "It was clever of Mrs. Cratchit, you mean? I just unravelled it. Don't be modest. You saw through Diana's manipulation, realised she was guiding our investigation. That took insight, or paranoia. I'm never quite sure which." Tommy picked up his pencil again, then set it down with a sigh. Do you ever wonder if we do more harm than good, Tuppence? Digging up secrets, exposing lies? Sometimes, she admitted, but I think the alternative is worse. If we don't pursue the truth, who will? If we let people get away with murder because it's complicated or uncomfortable, where does that lead? To a world where the powerful protect their own, and justice is whatever they decide it is. Tommy said quietly, Yes, I suppose you're right. A waiter appeared with fresh tea and a plate of scones. They busied themselves with cream and jam, a comfortable domestic ritual after the drama of the past weeks. I had a letter from Stella this morning, Tuppence said, slicing her scone with surgical precision. She's opened a bookshop in Bloomsbury. Says she's trying to build a new life away from all the memories. Good for her. She was the only genuinely innocent party in the whole affair. What about Meadows? Ah yes, faithful Meadows. Innocent of murder, perhaps, but complicit in the cover-up. He knew what Richard and Waverley had done, knew Beatrice had been killed, and said nothing for years. He was afraid, Tuppence pointed out. We're all afraid of something. The question is whether we let that fear dictate our choices. Tommy took a bite of scone, chewing thoughtfully, though I suppose that's easy to say from the safety of a Kensington cafe, with no Colonel Bradshaw threatening us. You're being philosophical again, Tuppence observed. That means the case is still bothering you. Of course it is. Cases like this always do. Tommy set down his scone untouched. Diana genuinely believed she was protecting her family. Mrs. Cratchit believed she was serving justice. Richard and Waverley believed they were just surviving the war. Everyone believed they were doing the right thing, or at least a justified thing. And yet, the result was murder and more murder. The road to hell, Tuppence murmured. Quite. Paved with good intentions and self-deception. Tommy looked out the window at the London street, where afternoon shoppers moved about their business, oblivious to the dark dramas that unfolded behind closed doors. Do you know what troubles me most? What? The thought that somewhere, right now, another Colonel Bradshaw is operating with impunity. Another Beatrice is discovering something she shouldn't. Another group of people is making the decision to protect themselves rather than do what's right. And we'll never know about it. We can't solve every mystery, Tommy. No. But it would be nice to think we could prevent some of them. They sat in companionable silence, watching the world go by. After a while, Tuppence spoke again. You know what I think? What's that, dear? I think you're worried we're becoming too good at this. That we're starting to see darkness everywhere, to suspect everyone. That we're losing our ability to see the good in people. Tommy looked at his wife with new respect. That's rather insightful of you. I have my moments, Tuppence smiled. But I don't think you need to worry. Yes, we've seen the worst of people, but we've also seen the best. Stella's courage in confronting the past, Meadows' late confession, even Richard and Waverley's decision to finally tell the truth. People are capable of both good and evil, often in the same breath. And our job is to sort out which is which. Our job is to pursue the truth wherever it leads. What people do with that truth is up to them. Tommy smiled, feeling some of the weight lift from his shoulders. Tuppence had always had that effect on him. The ability to clarify what seemed muddled, to find hope in darkness. When did you become so wise? He asked. I've always been wise. You just haven't always noticed. Touché. They finished their tea in better spirits, discussing lighter matters, the new Agatha Christie novel, whether to go to the theatre that weekend, what to have for dinner. The case of the Unbreakable Alibi receded into the past, another mystery solved, another set of secrets exposed, As they left the cafe, Tommy paused on the pavement, looking up at the clear spring sky. "Do you know what I think?" he said. "What's that? I think that despite everything, despite the lies and deaths and moral compromises, there's a certain satisfaction in uncovering the truth, in making sure that even if justice comes late, it comes eventually." Is that your way of saying you enjoyed the case? Enjoyed is too strong a word, but yes, I suppose it is. Good. Tuppence linked her arm through his. "Because I had another letter this morning from a Mrs. Pemberton in Cornwall. She says her husband disappeared 3 weeks ago under mysterious circumstances, and she wonders if we might help." Tommy groaned theatrically. "Can't we have a few weeks of peace and quiet?" "Peace and quiet is overrated, darling. You'd be bored within a week." "True," Tommy admitted. "Very true." They walked down the street together, back toward their flat and whatever mysteries the future held. Behind them, the cafe door closed with a soft chime, marking the end of one adventure and the promise of another. The case of the Unbreakable Alibi was solved, but in the solving, they'd learned what they'd always known in their hearts. That truth was worth pursuing, even when it brought pain. That justice mattered, even when it came too late. And that some mysteries, like the human capacity for both good and evil, would never be entirely solved. But that was all right, because as long as there were people willing to ask difficult questions, to challenge easy answers, to pursue truth through darkness, people like Tommy and Tuppence Beresford, then perhaps there was hope after all. "Cornwall, you say?" Tommy asked as they walked. Sounds intriguing, doesn't it? Everything sounds intriguing to you, Tuppence. That's why you married me." "One of many reasons," Tommy agreed, smiling despite himself. And as they disappeared into the London afternoon, a new mystery already taking shape in their minds, one thing was certain. The game, as it always was afoot, but perhaps that was a story for another day.